I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you the news from Ukraine, Russia and Brussels as missiles rain down on Kyiv, the EU meets for a high-stakes meeting on Ukraine, and Vladimir Putin hosts an annual phone-in from Moscow.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Thursday, the 14th of December, 1 year and 293 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nichols and live from the EU's meeting in Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Well, good afternoon, David. Hello, everybody. So last night was characterised, as recent nights have been, with more aerial attacks across Ukraine, but centred on Odessa in the south and Kyiv, the capital, in the north. So Russia apparently launched 42 drones across the south. Ukraine's Air Force said it has shot down 41 of them, all Shaheeds, 131, 136. Buildings damaged and injuries. The Air Force also said that 6 S-300 anti-aircraft missiles were fired at Kherson and, in the Kherson and Mykolaiv regions. Those caused deaths as well as injuries. And then, as we were coming on air today, so far today there have been 3 air raid sirens across Kyiv's oblast in the north. Now, the cyber attack that we talked about for the last couple of days, Russian hackers that attacked the Kyivstar mobile network on Tuesday apparently gained access from an employee's compromised account, that was from the chief executive. So Alexander Komarov said his company had repelled more than 500 attempted cyber attacks since the start of the full-scale invasion. Kyivstar, you'll remember, is Ukraine's leading mobile data provider, more than 24 million customers. But I'm told by people in the country that the attack was aimed at all telecoms providers and possibly banks too. 2 Ukrainian banks have issued statements saying that their IT response was effective, which obviously implies that they were swept up in an attack, if not the same attack. Also suggests those banks that haven't said anything, we don't know if that was effective. It's always interesting with cyber attacks as to whether or not banks and other institutions come forward and say they have been hacked and they've been successful or not. Because of the confidence levels, it can then either damage or, what you might think is a statement to shore up support can actually have the opposite effect. So just the fact that they haven't made a statement doesn't mean that they were compromised, but it does look to be wider than just a Kyivstar. Separately, Russia apparently has put the head of Ukraine's military intelligence on its wanted list. So General Budanov, that we've spoken of many, many times, they've said he organised the October 22 attack on the Kerch Bridge and lots of other stuff. I mean, I don't think he'll worry too much about that being on a wanted list, seeing as how they've tried to kill him a few times, and his wife was poisoned using mercury and arsenic. We think she's still poorly. She wasn't killed, thankfully. But yeah, so he's not going to worry too much about that. What else is there? A couple of other things. So today's British MOD statement was talking about the new VDV, Russian Airborne Forces formation, that we spoke about, I think, last week, if not the week before. So they said they were talking about the 104th Guards Airborne Division, a newly formed Russian parachute division, so circa 8,000 to 10,000 people. British MOD saying it suffered exceptionally heavy losses when it's tried to dislodge Ukrainian forces from the Dnipro bridgehead. So they're saying the 104th Guards Airborne Division was decimated in early December, trying to push the Ukrainians off the left bank of the Dnipro. It said the formation was reportedly poorly supported by air power and artillery, while many of the troops were highly likely inexperienced. We were talking about it because the newly installed head of it, Colonel General Mikhail Teplinsky, he is also the head of the VDV. He's a kind of the sort of regimental colonel, if you like, of the VDV. So it was quite telling that he was put in charge of this new force, and Russian bloggers a couple of weeks ago, this is why we were talking about it, they were calling on him to resign because the force hasn't performed very well and has obviously not ejected Ukraine from the Dnipro. So let's keep our eyes on that. Now then, I'm going to talk a little bit later about a development today in terms of support for Ukraine from external supporters. But just for now, we were talking yesterday about Norway's donation of NASAMS missiles to Ukraine. We think now a bit more detail on that, partly coming from Norway's own stockpiles, the rest delivered in a paid-for industry, so buying off-the-shelf type arrangement. Defence Minister Bjorn Graham said this will be a major contribution to Ukraine's ability to defend themselves, and it's going to be a total of $30 million worth of missiles there. Australia, news from Australia, they're expanding their training program for Ukrainian soldiers. That's going up to about $125 million. Operation Kudu deploys Australian instructors into Britain to take part in the sort of multinational training program and all the exercises. Australian instructors so far trained about 1,200 Ukrainian troops. And Finland and the US are about to sign a defence pact, which is, Finland is joining NATO, so there's that collective security pact anyway, but this mutual agreement will enable US forces to have rapid and unimpeded access to Finnish bases and military storage facilities in the event of war. They're expected to sign that deal next Monday in Washington. And then just finally, Denmark is going to put to its parliament a new package of about 1.1 billion US dollars in terms of military aid for Ukraine. So Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, she announced a plan yesterday as she met President Zelensky, along with the leaders of Finland, Iceland, Norway and Sweden, all met in Oslo. Now, Denmark has already provided about $3 billion in military aid and about another $500 million in humanitarian aid since the start of the full-scale invasion. Worth noting the comments from Phillips O'Brien, the Professor of Strategic Studies at the University of St Andrews. He said, pay attention to what's happening here. Denmark is offering a new military package to Ukraine worth about $1.8 billion in total. The US he carries on, the US in its entirety since February the 24th last year has given $44 billion in military aid. This one new package of Denmark is worth 5% of all the aid the USA has given. I mention it because in the absence of, the bill in Congress is still being held up, unlikely to see anything there before the Christmas break. Same with the EU. Viktor Orban from Hungary is holding up bits and pieces there, although we'll hear more about that shortly. But these bilateral arrangements whereby countries are sort of saying, if we can't do it as the EU, we'll just do it, which has got to be a pretty good workaround, although it does lend a certain coherence to the whole thing. Anyway, it's moving in the right direction and worth looking at those percentages. Obviously, the size Denmark's economy dwarfed by the US, but in terms of percentages of their GDP and defence budget, very, very significant contribution there. And I'll take a little pause there, David.
Thank you very much, Dom. As you said, there's lots to return to later when we come back to you. Well, let's go to this incredibly important EU meeting. Joe Barnes, you're in Brussels. You're at the meeting. Where are you calling us from?
Actually, just outside of the security cordon of the meeting, because I've popped out to find some sort of fresh air and a place to speak to you from. So it's very busy and the whirring sounds of cars, etc. But yeah, it's incredibly important. I guess we don't appreciate how important it is until you look at if the EU and the US's support becomes blocked, that's really problematic. So Volodymyr Zelensky appearing via video link at the summit rather than in-person appearance, he warned European leaders that the decision they make today will go down in history. So the decisions to be made are, can Ukraine officially start membership talks to join the EU? And then there is also talks over a 50 billion euro financial support package for Ukraine, which is basically to help fund the Ukrainian state over the next 4 years. And that's on the table. So the stakes aren't incredibly high. So Volodymyr Zelensky, and I'll quote what he said, appearing via video link, "Today is a special day, and this day will go down in our history. Whether it's good or bad for us, history will capture everything. Every word, every step, every action and inaction. Who fought for what?" And then he added, "Today is the day when determination will either be in Brussels or Moscow. People in Europe won't understand if Putin's satisfied smile becomes the reward for a meeting in Brussels. So what is he referring to? He is referring to the veto that Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, is currently wielding over those two decisions. He is seen as the principal, the chief opponent of offering Ukraine political and financial support at this time. So Viktor Orban arrived at the summit in Brussels, held in the Justice Lipsius and the Europa building of the European Council. And he told reporters that he was basically against those two packages. He said that Ukraine does not deserve to start negotiations or receive money from the EU's joint budget. So what do we know about Viktor Orban and Hungary? So Hungary has repeatedly delayed the EU's response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, while not outright blocking it at times. He's just delayed it, stifled it, made it weaker, essentially. He vocally opposes sanction measures against Moscow. Hungary doesn't donate any weapons to Ukraine. Viktor Orban, he became the first and only EU leader to meet Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, this year, when they were spotted shaking hands at a Chinese Belt and Road summit. And Hungary makes he doesn't hide the fact that it does sort of huge amounts of business with Russia, still buying lots of fossil fuels, etc. And this is what Viktor Orban had to say. He said, look, there is no reason to discuss anything because the preconditions are not met. He's referring, this is on the membership. The European Commission last month recommended that EU member states start these formal talks. It had a 7-point checklist. And Viktor Orban says at least 3 of those 7 points of reform that Ukraine had to carry out haven't been met yet. So he's basically saying, look, Ukraine is not ready. It shouldn't be offered talks. And then on to the finances. He goes, in the long term, the bigger sum of money, my decision is it should go from outside the EU's budget. So he's talking about doing something external and not actually from the EU's coffers. So maybe an intergovernmental agreement. So what are we in for today? I might be going too early, but I'm predicting that we won't have a decision. My story will run well beyond this sort of the print deadlines that we have at the Telegraph. And so it's a 2-day summit planned in Brussels. So today and tomorrow, but it could well go into Saturday. So Finland's Prime Minister said, as he entered the summit, I'm ready to negotiate. I've packed many shirts if it takes us a long time. He went on to say that, look, our support for Ukraine is crucial because our security and existence as a credible union depends on it. So largely, leaders of the other 26 countries are supportive of Ukraine's EU membership ambitions. So they basically got Viktor Orban to break down. There have been some interesting sort of developments. Austria came out and said it was against a swift accession. So it didn't want Ukraine's membership process to be fast-talked. You look at sort of Turkey, even though it doesn't really want to join the EU anymore, but has been negotiating to join for, nearly 30 years in total. So what we're looking at now is there is a blockage, there is a panic. So EU officials on the sidelines are looking at coming up with a separate package of support, which would be an intergovernmental agreement between member states that wants to commit money to basically as a bridging exercise to make sure Ukraine has funds for 2024. That would be more costly and harder to bring together and would basically be less stable than a proper EU level thing, given the international finances and borrowing money on the market stuff that my head is lost in that world. But yeah, interesting summit. Atmosphere is different. It's strange. People are obviously feeling that the pressure is really on. That's what I'd say. Lots of people are tense. They know what's at stake. And I'll stop there, David.
Thank you so much for that, Joe. Could you just give us, you started there, but it'd be good to hear a bit more. As you said, incredibly important summit, tense atmosphere in Brussels. When you go back through the security cordon, back into the meeting, what do you see? What's happening? Are people rushing around in suits? Is it one of those summits where it's actually there's far too many people for the building itself, so everybody's crammed up together? Can you just take us inside what you're seeing?
Yeah, so we are stuck in a press centre, press hall, which is in basically the main atrium of this building. It's 1,000 journalists, probably maybe more, sometimes 1,800. I think there was 17 or 27 Ukrainian journalists travelling especially over for this moment to cover the news. So yeah, it's overpacked. People are working, laptops, slow Wi-Fi, sort of all things that are characteristic of working at international summits. You'll get the occasional diplomat will pop down into the press room and then suddenly chats will turn into these vast huddles where they're telling you what the leaders are saying in the room, trying to get their positions across. No doubt when people start coming down, they'll be bad-mouthing Viktor Orban if he continues to block stuff, because he's not the most favoured guy in the EU at the moment. So the Commission yesterday did announce the release of 10 billion euros in blocked funds that are due to Hungary but are being withheld over fears of its sort of democratic backsliding, erosion of democracy. It's a lack of the rule of law there as considered by the EU. They were blocked, and that was hoped that would sort of help ease talks today, but it doesn't seem to have changed Viktor Orban's mind for now. But yeah, it's an interesting mix. Lots of Ukrainians, lots of people waiting carefully to decide and see what happens, and lots of busy fingers tapping away at their laptops.
Thank you so much, Joe, for taking us inside the meeting in Brussels. Do come back next week and we can catch up on what's actually happened, how it happened, and what the impact will be. Thank you so much, Joe. I know you have to run off to write something for the Telegraph, so thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us. Dom, we'll come back to you shortly, but let's just talk a little bit about Vladimir Putin's, it's his first major press conference since the war in Ukraine began. This is his 3-hour end-of-year combined press conference and public phone-in to the Kremlin. This started at 9 a.m. GMT. That was 12 p.m. local time in Moscow. Journalists and members of the public asked him questions. And just remember, the annual call-in marathon, usually does this every year, was cancelled last year and has returned this year ahead of the presidential elections that he is standing in March 2024. Now, just before we go through some of the quotes and questions, let's frame this. James Kilner, our regular guest and foreign correspondent, he was watching this and he gave me some pointers. He can't join himself. He does send his apologies. He can't join, but he gave us some quotes just so we can frame how we read this well. James told me, basically, Putin is using the war in Ukraine as the backdrop to his phone-in. The second question was a pre-recorded address by a group of Russian soldiers on the front lines wearing badges with Putin's face on them. They looked to be standing in a bunker, and you could apparently hear machine gun fire in the background. So let's go through some of the quotes. Vladimir Putin has said the war in Ukraine will only end when the country demilitarizes and is, quote, denazified. No surprises there. He said the peace will come when we reach our goals. And he still called it a special military operation. Coming back to our goals, he said, they remain unchanged. I will remind you, it means denazification, demilitarization of Ukraine and its neutral status. He also said Ukrainian soldiers have failed everywhere in their counteroffensive. You can hear me just turning my pages. My laptop is broken, so I'm trying to reading this analog. He described Ukraine's political leadership as foolish and irresponsible and said that Russian forces were advancing across the front line. He said our armed forces are improving their position on almost the entire line of contact. The situation of our troops is improving throughout. He also said, and this is interesting, there will be no additional mobilization of men for the war in Ukraine. He said that 300,000 people were called up last year. He also said Ukraine was freeloading and will eventually run out of Western aid because it manufactures nothing itself. He quote, they have been trying to maintain their manufacturing capability, but they have actually been importing things for free, freeloading, but it will come to an end sooner or later. A couple of other points. He spoke about Evan Guskovich, the WSJ reporter, the Wall Street Journal reporter, imprisoned since March 2023. The context of this is that today a Moscow court upheld a ruling to hold Guskovich in detention until January. He was arrested in Russia completely spuriously, we believe, in March this year on espionage charges. Putin said that he hopes for a, quote, mutually acceptable solution when asked if he would consider a prisoner swap for Evan Guskovich. He said, it's not that we declined to send them home. No, we want to come to terms, and these agreements must be mutually acceptable and should be okay for both of the parties. He said that there had been dialogue with the US about Guskovich, and he hoped for a solution. Quote, but the American side should listen to us and make a decision that would be satisfactory for the Russian side also. Couple of other bits and pieces. Vladimir Putin apologized to a pensioner who urged him to take mercy on elderly Russians and reduce the cost of eggs amid soaring inflation. He said, I am very sorry, please accept my apologies for that, adding that imports from Turkey and Belarus would increase supply and reduce prices. One thing to mention, and I know, Dom, we noticed this together before we came on air, was that in the background we saw quite a few critical text messages were displayed on screens at the press conference. One read, Mr. President, when will the real Russia be the same as the one on TV? Another asked, why is your reality at odds with our lived reality? Another said, don't run for another term as president, make way for the young. Another said, this question won't be shown. I'd like to know, when will our president pay attention to his own country? We've got no education, no healthcare. The abyss lies ahead. Mr. Putin, unsurprisingly, did not respond to any of the text messages. So on this, I asked James Kilner, who's watching, what does this mean? Is this genuine? Is this a gaffe by the organisers? He was fairly firm. He said, planted by the Kremlin to create the image of genuine Q&A session. They've done this before. Remember, optics are everything. Importantly, the criticism was light, limited to text messages, not live TV questions, and didn't mention the war. All giveaways. Anyway, I think that's probably quite enough of Vladimir Putin's marathon question and answer session. Dom, did anything stand out for you from that? And if not, let's move on to your interesting morning at the Estonian embassy.
Yeah, well, you and I were chatting about those comments, whether or not they were staged. I mean, they probably were. It was a bit of a cock up to actually put them on the wall behind him if you didn't mean to, but they were quite punchy. And even if the Kremlin liked to put them up there, phrases like the abyss lies ahead and what have you. Now they might, if it was staged and they put them up there to show that how we're happy to take criticism from anywhere. I mean, these things you've got to be really careful about how these things land, because some people might, even if they're not going to take that phrase, for example, the abyss lies ahead, they're not going to suddenly sort of scratch it on a t-shirt and run out in the street shouting the abyss lies ahead. But if you plant that seed in people's minds, then it could cause trouble. So I'm still not entirely sure whether it was totally staged and not Captain Cock-Up again, but I think James is probably on the money there. Again, these were it's an annual event. Now, last year, it was notable that Putin cancelled it because of the way that the war was going, and we made a big deal of it at the time because I think it was quite significant. I don't think we should get too bent out of shape this year that it's back on. We shouldn't say, oh, bloody hell, that's because they're winning. I mean, this is sort of a return to what it was before. And actually, it costs him nothing to do it, and it's another opportunity for him to spout off. And if he didn't do it, we would again say, oh, he's worried about his domestic opinion. So I don't think we need to get too worked up about the fact that it was on again. It doesn't show that he's massively confident, because he's deluded in his own confidence anyway. He believes what he wants to believe, so it matters not what the reality is. So yeah, it's fine. I've not dissected it in any great detail because I've been in the Estonian embassy, as you say. So those are just my sort of hot takes, if you like.
Well, thank you very much, Dom. I'm sure we'll come back to this on Monday. It would be really good to get James on. Listeners will be aware that I've been covering it, but relying really on James to give that framing and give some advice about how we report it and how careful we should be. Obviously, we're aware that at the end of the phone-in, apparently Putin was asked a question by an AI body double. I believe that's going to lead the Telegraph website at the moment, or our coverage of the phone-in. So do look at that story. We haven't had time to get to it, I'm afraid. Happened just as we were writing it up, just as we went on air. So I think we will return to that. It's an interesting thing. Dom, you said you'd been at the Estonian embassy. Why did you go? What did you hear?
Yeah, so I was invited over there. 5 journalists. 5 journalists invited to the Estonian embassy this morning for a briefing by their Ministry of Defence's Permanent Secretary, Mr. Kusti Salm, a chap I've met before. Good bloke, big beefy brain box chap. So Estonia's MOD has released a document this morning. I've got it in front of me here. It's online. You'll be able to find it. It's all open source. It's called Setting Transatlantic Defence Up for Success, a Military Strategy for Ukraine's Victory and Russia's Defeat. It's pretty short, 20-odd pages, pretty punchy, very well researched, good stats. And they are basically setting out their assessment of numbers, for starters, about the amount of equipment that's available, and more importantly, the kind of defence industrial base potential for regenerating both in Russia and Ukraine with external support. And they're making the point, the top line, if you like, is they say that victory for Ukraine could come in 3 years, they assess, if they've taken the Ramstein group, so the 50-odd nation group of military support for Ukraine. So it's bigger than just NATO, it's bigger than the EU. When we talk about the regular monthly Ramstein contact group meetings, donating and pledging military aid for Ukraine, that's their sort of building block that they're working from. And they've said that if the Ramstein group each committed 0.25% of their GDP annually towards military assistance to Ukraine, which could come out of their defence budgets, then they say Estonia says that would generate 120 billion euros a year, which is more than sufficient resources to implement this strategy. And they say that they could achieve victory in 3 years' time. Now, I'm going slowly because it's literally hot off the press, and I've only just had all the quotes cleared. Literally, while we've been on air in the last few moments, I had the quotes cleared for you, so I will try not to mangle them. But Estonia is saying that the Ramstein Group has a combined GDP of 47 trillion euros. Total commitments of military aid to Ukraine thus far are around 95 billion, so 0.2% of that. And they say at the same time, the defence budgets are 13 times bigger. The Ramstein Group defence budget, 13 times bigger than Russia's. So it's entirely doable. And if so far Ramstein groups have committed 0.2% of GDP, then a regular commitment of 0.25%, as Estonia did this morning on the way in to the meeting that Joe was just talking about. The Estonian Prime Minister he gave a doorstep conference, and they've committed to providing 0.25% of their defence budget, of their GDP for the next 4 years to Ukraine support. So they're saying if everybody did that, then this can work. And the figures they put on it, they look at they've gone into the sort of defence industrial capacity, and they say that looking at what they can likely extrapolate, albeit with question marks over what might happen in the US with a potential second Trump presidency. But if an extrapolation from today with the figures that can reasonably be expected to come in, then they say that Ukraine can be supported to see them through to victory. So Mr. Salm said, some quotes here, he said, real leadership is always revealed when the room gets dark, and we're in a situation now when it's starting to get dark. He said there is a consensus between the defence ministries and the intelligence agencies that Russia will regenerate. The only question is whether it's going to happen in 3, 4, 5, 6 or 7 years. But the consensus is that they will regenerate everything that they have lost in Ukraine, and they will come back stronger. So he was sort of setting the case out for a coherent effort for everybody to step up here. He said Russia is able to generate about 130,000 soldiers every 6 months. Now, of those 130,000, he said only about 40,000 go into sort of formed, ready-to-go units. The rest are still in some areas of training or put as individual reinforcements. But they're only generating about 40,000 new units, people in units every 6 months. And said the current rate of attrition is about 50,000. So Ukraine are killing and severely wounding about 50,000 Russians every 6 months. Of course, it's gone up slightly in the last few weeks around Avdiivka, but taken as an average, 50,000. So the point he's making is if Ukraine is able to sustain the rate of production of personnel and equipment and increase in line with what Russia is likely to be able to do with its economy, that it's put onto a war footing, then it will be long and slow, but the maths are in Ukraine's favour. He said that criticisms of the external supporters for Ukraine have been slow to ramp up their industrial production was fair, but he said that's a good thing. Politically, if the attention or problem is in the limelight, it's a good thing because then prime ministers and defence ministers have to deal with it. He said Estonia's assessment is that by the early quarters of 2025, European and US manufacturers combined will get the yearly manufacturing rate of artillery ammunition, 155mm artillery ammunition, in excess of 2 million rounds a year. And their analysis, Estonia's MOD analysis, is that the level of attrition that Ukraine needs to affect on Russia can be sustained at around 200,000 rounds a month. So 2 million rounds a year comes just under that. So then they're talking about this way, saying we need to ramp it up, but we're not far off it. And he said, why is this 200,000 figure a month important? It's important because it's doable and it's affordable. It's not a Herculean effort. So I think that's about it there. What else was I? Well, yeah, sorry, just one other point. He's making the case there about what the cost, 120 billion euros a year. He said the European Union's response to the COVID pandemic was 807 billion euros, around 20 times more than the current level of military aid to Ukraine. So, look at an existential crisis such as the pandemic, and the EU and others did step up. And he's saying we can do it. We can do this. We just need a bit of resolve. We just need to galvanise around a group, an individual, somebody. We've talked about this earlier in the week. Somebody to actually say, right, well, come on, then let's do it. He said, if we make a cost-benefit analysis here again, putting up money for that cause will bring you the strategic stability return. Winning in Ukraine is mathematically doable. It's doable in terms of euros. It's doable in terms of sustaining the same things that we've done already. Victory can be achieved in 3 years. So, not an evidence-free cause for optimism, and that optimism is bounded by saying we've still got to do it. I mean, this is not happening at the moment. It needs somebody to get everyone by the scruff of the collar and say, right, are you up for this? Right, let's do it then. So back to the point I made in the updates earlier, it's terrific to see the countries, Norway and Denmark and what have you, doing their own individual thing. And that is good. It's all going in the right direction. But it needs to be cohered. It needs somebody, it's unlikely to be NATO, but somebody, EU, US potentially, or a European figure to say, right, I will lead this. I will take this blueprint and we'll make it work. That might be through the Ramstein process, or it might be an adjunct to it. But the maths are there. This was a very evidence-heavy, very data-heavy document, very digestible, actually, even for me. So, do go and have a look at it. And it sets it out in clear terms how the numbers, if people will stand together, external supporters for Ukraine, the numbers are very, very heavily in Ukraine's favour. But it needs that political will and political resolve to see it through. But all in all, a useful contribution, David, I think, to the debate at the moment about where we are. It's at the moment it's sort of drifting into prose. It's allowing Putin to make speeches about how it's all going brilliantly. Actually, here's the data. Here are the data to suggest that need not be the case. But there are certain actions that have to be taken to make it so. But well worth a look, David.
Thank you very much, Dom. Just very quickly, when you left the embassy after this session, how optimistic did you feel?
Blimey. How optimistic? Well, so the first question I asked him, put it this way, so when we had the Q&A, I said, why have you produced this document? And he sort of looked a bit blank. And I said, well, if this is evident, if this is obvious to military and political leaders, then why aren't they doing it? And why hasn't somebody come up with it? Why aren't these conversations happening behind closed doors? Why have you had to produce a document that's gone public and for which you've got journalists in to talk about it? And so I said, is that not the sort of soft underbelly of the whole thing here, that political will? If this is going to take years, and this is what Putin wants, if this takes years, then democracy says that, well, they could all be voted out of office next year, the year after that, or what have you. That's the brilliance and the weakness of democracy, that we can kick out elected leaders if we don't like them. So was I feeling optimistic? I think, oh God, I sound like a politician myself. I think it's a very useful contribution to the discussion. I hope the discussion was already happening, and this is providing a bit more data and a bit more analysis. Do I think there's a politician able to stand up and champion this and go for it? I don't know. I'd be very interested to hear the comments from, for example, Mette Frederiksen. Her name was linked to a potential successor to Jens Stoltenberg as Secretary General for NATO. So she's a heavy hitter in this area, and obviously coming on the back of Denmark's nearly $1.1 billion announcement today, she might be in a position to say something. I want to see momentum now. I want other people to talk about it this weekend. I want other people for it to be part of the debate rather than just another document that's, oh yeah, thanks for that, and chucked aside. But I come back to that point, like, why did you feel the need to do it? And obviously these documents don't just happen. This didn't just start today. This would have been in process for probably 3 months, I guess. So that implies that the very senior levels of Estonian government were sufficiently concerned 3 months ago that they needed to produce this. So I'm not an evidence avoiding fanboy of Ukraine, no matter what the trolls will say in the comments. I look at the evidence and I base my analysis accordingly. So yeah, I am very glad it's out there. Whether or not I'm any more optimistic, well, that's for the jury's still out on that one, because I want to see other people in very senior positions. I want to see their reaction to this before I start popping any sort of optimistic bubbles.
Well, thank you very much. Dom, just one more quick question from me. You obviously spent quite a lot of time with the Estonians over the past 2 years. Did they not invite you to go winter swimming again, or is that something you'd be up for?
They did. I spoke to the ambassador. So for those that haven't got a clue what Dave was wibbling on about, February the 24th, the date of the full-scale invasion last year, it's also Estonia's Independence Day. And on February 24th earlier this year, I was invited along with some other journalists and diplomats and people in London to join the Estonian ambassador at the Serpentine for a swim, because they're mad for their outdoor stuff and rolling around in snow and hitting each other with birch twigs and all that kind of jazz. Anyway, so we went for a nice cold swim, all part of the sort of wellness and embracing nature and all that kind of jazz. It was bloody freezing. I made a film, took a film crew from here because I had a stupid idea of interviewing the ambassador in the water, which seemed like a great idea at the time from a nice warm office, but actually when it comes to it and they have to take an extra 30 seconds to put another lens on or whatever they did, it was horrific. Anyway, they were going to do it again next February, but apparently the park has said they're not allowed to do it. It's something about not what the park is there for. I don't know. So unfortunately, no more frozen swimming for Domballs next year, David.
Thank you very much for that, Dom. Well, let's go to our final thoughts then. Dom, I mean, don't worry, I won't ask you for a long one today, but taking all of this together, where do you think we are coming to the end of December 2023?
Well, okay, so this week's Defence in Depth goes up tonight at about 6 p.m. on YouTube, London time. It's going to be the last one of the year and the last one of the series. We're going to take a little break, so I've done a kind of reflective there about where we are. I've said that 2023 has been a year of questions where Ukraine was asked what it is militarily capable of, and the counteroffensive fell short of what of the gains it hoped to make. Clearly, they would have taken a lot of lessons from the counteroffensive, but there's no denying that it didn't get geographically as far as they'd hoped at all. So there are questions there. There's questions about international support before and during the counteroffensive, but especially after it now. There was a sort of euphoria, wasn't there? Before the counteroffensive, there was almost this sort of blithe, once that happens, it'll all be over by, almost First World War-ish, it'll be over by Christmas. So there's big questions here for the international external supporters of Ukraine. It's like, are you serious? You up for this? You're in this for the long term? Because you've got an idea now about what this is going to look like. Your people, and this contribution today from Estonia's MOD is a brilliant document. There are some numbers now, and we're talking early 2025 terms. We're not saying the next few weeks. We're not even talking spring, summer 2024. We're talking years here. So, questions for you, international audience. Are you up for this? And also, I think there's questions for all of us individually about things like, do we have the right to be fatigued? I remember that the interview we did with Tim Snyder a couple of weeks ago, where he said we outside the country do not have the right. I disagree with him on that one. I think we do. I think it shows that our moral compass is in the right place and functioning correctly. I put it all in context, but yes, I think we do have the right to feel exhausted, fatigued, frustrated, angry, as long as we keep going, we don't give up. So I think 2023 has been a year of big questions. They will obviously endure into 2024, but I think there is a slowly coalescing idea that somebody needs to step up here and start making some pretty good speeches. You've seen President Zelensky out in the US. He's probably going to be slightly disappointed that he didn't get the response he wanted in his US trip this week. But I think now's the time for leadership. We need leaders to step forward. We need leaders to make the case to their publics about why this is our vital interests are at stake here, why this needs to cost us money, why we need to, if they go with this plan from Estonia, put 0.25% of GDP towards Ukraine for the next few years, make those commitments now. So we need people to make the case and win these arguments. And I just feel that this is starting to come together. And so early in the new year, I would think that there will be political moves. There has to be, because at the moment it's just drifting slightly, and the information space, to use a very wonkish term, is being filled by the Russian narrative. So I think there will be Western politicians. It's a bit like they're like toddlers in a way. It's like eventually you have to drag them to it. Like, come on, can you attend to this, please? I've told you to clear your room now 4 times. Can you get on with the speeches, Ukraine? Okay. So I think they will eventually step forward. And what they have to say, obviously, we do not know. But yeah, a lot of questions in 2023. And I think the answers will come pretty soon in 2024. But yeah, I've thrashed out those thoughts to a greater degree in today's final Defence in Depth out this evening.
Just a quick message from me. Huge congratulations from Ukraine the Latest and the Telegraph to our wonderful colleague, defence editor Danielle Sheridan, on her getting engaged. Congratulations, Danny. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from the Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to the Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our world affairs newsletter which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Giles Gear, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.